a lot going on in that in that part of the world and during that time period. And I had the good fortune to read the book. It's a great read. It takes you back to those very dramatic events and those fast-moving years. Very, very enlightening. It's a very good read about the developments and events in the region, U.S. strategy and policy there. But also, it's a very reflective look at leadership, military leadership, leadership in general, and a number of sort of themes that he reflects on after his years of service, not only in CENTCOM, but in other positions in the military and in the United States government in general. So, General McKenzie, it's great to have you here. This conversation will start with sort of a back and forth between me and General McKenzie, and then we'll open it up for conversation or Q&A with members of the audience. The conversation is being taped, is not being live streamed, so the conversation will later be put on our website for people to view. So, General McKenzie, welcome, and maybe let's start with the headline of the book, the title of the book, The Melting Point. Where is that from, and why is that important to you, and what does that mean as a core reflection of your book?
So the title is taken from a passage from Barbara Tuchman's great book, The Guns of August, which talks about how Europe entered the First World War. And I think it's an important book. And Kennedy read the book right before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mm-hmm. It may have had an effect on him as he entered that very important period. So I've always enjoyed the book. And in the book, there's a passage where she writes, "That melting point of warfare, the temperament of the individual commander." And so that always struck me. I was always drawn to it. So I was a commander during these events that you've discussed. I wasn't an observer. I wasn't on the sidelines. I was right in the middle. And so I wanted to. It was cathartic to me, first of all, to write about it. I enjoy writing, and I wanted to tell it from my perspective. And the perspective is that of a combatant commander. And in our system, a combatant commander is unique in that you have the opportunity to give advice, and then you have the responsibility for execution. Mm-hmm. A lot of people give advice. A lot of people execute. Not many people do both. Mm-hmm. And really, it's the combatant commander who does that. It's unique. It's a unique role, and you're certainly a junior partner to policy when you're in those discussions. But you are in the discussion. You do get an opportunity to say what you think, and sometimes you're listened to, and sometimes you're not. Mm-hmm. And that's appropriate in the way it should be. But I wanted to talk about that and sort of bring out my observations and my experiences about that.
Well, in the introduction, that General Jim Mattis wrote the foreword to the book, and obviously commends you a lot and focuses in on that issue and that quotation from Barbara Tuchman, and emphasizes a couple of things that I want to ask you about. One, as you say, is the metal, the sort of the core character of the person that's in the battle. And I want to ask you, once you were on the field, you were encountering these large sort of challenges, how did you, as a personal experience, go from sort of, the preparations for it to actually being, in the middle of it? How did that feel, and how did you come out of it? And secondly, what, also Jim Mattis emphasizes, that you're among a rare breed of military leaders who are both thinkers and executors, as you said. So my question there is, when you took on the position of Central Command, I think Joe Votel was your predecessor. Of course, you trained and read and thought about it. And as Jim Mattis says, with war, a lot of what you've thought about or expected sort of goes out the window right away, right. And you're just dealing with crisis after crisis. So those two questions: right. How did you personally experience it and come out of it? And then, between your thoughts and the chaos of war, what did you learn?
So I think over the course of a long military career, you execute training for certain specific contingencies, mm-hmm. how you fight, how you employ weapons, and those are pretty straightforward things, and you know how to do those things. Now, there's art in how you choose to apply them, but nonetheless, there are things you train to. Mm-hmm. Well, what you educate for and what you read for and develop a sense of history is for the unknown, mm-hmm. and for the things that can't be anticipated. And so I would argue the further you go up the chain of command, the more you need to be prepared to deal with the unknown, because there are many things out there that you can't know, none more than probably in Central Command, where there's so many things that emerge on a daily basis. And so I found that what worked for me, first of all, I'd been well trained. I was in a service that trains its people very well how to fight. So I had had great confidence in my ability to do that and how to use the weapon systems that Central Command had. But at the same time, you know, you go beyond that, because as a combatant commander, you're astride the military world, but you interact with diplomats, you interact with USAID, you interact with nations across the region, the 21 nations in the region, of which, you know, I did frequent business with 19 of them, and so that is different, and you prepare for that, I think, by a broad general education, by experience, and for me at least, you know, having been the J5 at CENTCOM, then what we call the big J5 on the Joint Staff, and then the director of the Joint Staff, working under a brilliant chairman, in General Joe Dunford, gave me the opportunity to get that broad exposure, particularly to the interagency. I'd had that before early on when I was a one-star working for Admiral Mullen, when I did presidential transition for him from when the Obama administration came
over,
in.
yeah.
So that was my first exposure to it. But you find that's very useful as you go forward. You understand how you actually interface with the various levers of the interagency process. And so that to me is part of it. But now to your other question, which I think is really a very good question, is, so how do you deal with it in terms of psychologically, how do you deal with the pressure of command? What I've always found useful is, this is not my idea, this is actually a great British commander, Field Marshal Slim, William Slim, known as Bill Slim, who fought in China, Burma, India in the Second World War, and is not known because that was a forgotten theater. But if you look at a standard military organization, it's a triangle. And the leader's on top, we all know that. You go down an echelon, there are more people, finally you get to the bottom, and at CENTCOM there might have been, on any given day, 70 to 100,000 people that were answering my command that I was responsible for. But the way to think about it when you got to make hard decisions is you need to turn that pyramid over. And you need to realize that at the top, where I'm at CENTCOM, I've got all kinds of advice, I've got all kinds of help. I had 14 lawyers on staff at U.S. Central Command.
I'm sorry about
that. I survived. But as you get closer to where the FLOT is, the forward line on troops, where contact with the enemy is, eventually you get down to that one man or woman. And so when you make decisions, in the back of your mind as a COCOM, and really at any level, you need to realize that your decisions ultimately are going to be transmuted into that single person, and there's nobody between them and the enemy. They're the point. And so, to me at least, it gave sort of a moral freight to my decisions, and I would try to balance that as I went through the process. It worked for me. Everybody's got a different approach. That was my particular approach.
Yeah. Well, let me sort of try to walk you, or have you walk us through chronologically. I first want to ask, when you were deployed, when you're selected as head of Central Command, in the sense, what was your mission set? What were you asked to do? What did you expect you were going to face? And then obviously we'll go through the things you actually did face.
So there's no shortage of guidance for a combatant commander. You know, you've got things ranging from the contingency planning guidance to the unified command plan to all kinds of other formal guidance that you get. And every secretary, well, two of the three secretaries I work with gave me formal written guidance as well, and that was very useful. And really, it was. We focused on Iran as the principal threat in the theater. We also, you know, had guidance on conduct of operations in Afghanistan, conduct of operations in Iraq, and some other boilerplate language there. But when I took command, I was lucky because I'd had a lot of experience at CENTCOM. I'd been down there 2 years as the J5, working for a brilliant commander in Jim Mattis. I'd worked as a three-star, the Marine Forces Central Command commander for General Lloyd Austin when he was the commander of CENTCOM. So I'd seen how good commanders operated, and what I thought needed to happen was, over years, CENTCOM had become focused on the war in Afghanistan, where you've got a 4-star subordinate commander running that. The war in Iraq and the war in Syria, where you've got a subordinate JTF running that. And that was appropriate and accurate. But we had sort of given the management of the Iran problem to a small compartmented group within Central Command. And I felt that if you're going to fight a nation state, you need to fight it as the commander. And that means you've got to employ the general staff of the headquarters. So my first 60 days or so, and I reached out and talked to Jim Mattis about this actually, got his ideas on it because I'd seen him do some of this. What I wanted to do was reorient the headquarters so that we were focused on Iran. Iran as the single greatest problem that we faced. There were other tasks, and look, there were 4,000 people in my headquarters. I had lots of people to do lots of work. So it didn't mean we didn't look at other problems, but we looked at Iran. And I spent a significant fraction of my time thinking about Iran. And that was maybe a paradigm shift a little bit, but I came in at a time where Joe Votel had just ended the counter-ISIS campaign in March of 2019. So that had sort of entered a different phase.
Right.
The war in Afghanistan was the war in Afghanistan, but I had a competent and very good four-star in there running that war. And then, we were thinking about what we were going to do in Iraq and how we might draw down in Iraq. But Iraq was part of the Iran problem. So it sort of fell under that rubric of focusing on Iran. So I chose no reorganization of the headquarters was necessary. I simply placed functions inside the general staff. And so my theory was I didn't need a small compartmented group looking at it. If I'm going to think about something operational, the last person that I want to touch the operational matter is my J3. And I was very lucky. I had a guy named Sam Papero as my J3, who is now the Indo-PACOM commander and who is brilliant, one of the Navy's best admirals ever. And so I was very lucky. I had a great J2 and a guy named Dimitri Henry, who is now the Joint Staff J2, on and on. But I wanted to empower those general officers and flag officers to do that kind of work. And I felt actually it gave me better control over the problem because we would talk frequently, and in CENTCOM, because of the nature of what's going on, you're typically talking to your commanders, the 9 lieutenant generals that work for me, not the staff, but the commanders. I would talk to them most days of the week. And then typically on Friday, we'd do a planning day where I'd bring in just my planners, the bright colonels, lieutenant colonels that are very good at this. And I would spend a time in a room with just them and key members of my staff talking about our plans, where we are. And a headquarters like CENTCOM would hold about 30 war plans, some of which are very, very real, and you look at them every day. Some of which I would say are on life support. They're in planned maintenance, and you look at them occasionally. But some are very real, and some are you're prepping for the secretary to approve. Some of them he has approved, so you're just updating all the logistics data that's associated with those plans. But I felt it was important for the commander to be personally involved in that.
Well, let me take advantage of your experience and your reflections on these perennial or seemingly perennial problems like Iran. Never seem to really get it right, how to deal with Iran, how to contain Iran, how to deter Iran. What is it that you learned about Iran, or how America can or cannot deal with Iran? How can you deter Iran? A problem that's still going on till this very day. What are some of your takeaways?
So I have a theory of Iran, and here's my theory of Iran. First of all, let's start with the United States. We generally don't understand Iran. Most Americans, when they think of Iran, believe our history with Iran started in 78, 79, when they took the hostages at the embassy. The Iranians would say, well, you should consider 1950s when you came in and in a coup threw out our prime minister and put the Shah back on the peacock throne. But in reality, Iran is an imperial state going back thousands of years. Iran is not going away. It's going to be there, and it's going to be a regional power. And now we can talk about the leadership of it and what kind of leadership sits in Iran, but Iran as a nation state is going to be there. When I was preparing to go out to the region, I had an opportunity to spend some time with Ambassador Crocker. And he said, hey Frank, one thing you need to know, when you go to the region, there's only 2 real countries there. It's Egypt and Iran. Everybody else is just a tribe. And so I would just take that for what it's worth, but Iran is a nation. A real nation. So we need to understand that. So it's difficult for Americans to take the long view. The Iranians, they talk about things that happened 1,000 years ago like it was last week. That's not.
They're still sore about it.
That's not they still harbor those grudges. The United States, we don't operate like that. It may be good that we don't operate like that. So take that and then recognize that the regime in Iran today, they view themselves as a revolutionary regime, and the priority for a revolutionary regime is to preserve the revolution. They're also smart historians, and they recognize that typically revolutions get off course when the revolutionary generation passes from the stage, things that are beginning right now. So as a result of that, And they look at the example of the Russian Revolution, they look at the French Revolution and what happened after those revolutions. So the overriding priority, the overriding strategic priority for Iran is preservation of the theocratic regime that sits on top of it. And so they will adopt whatever measures are necessary to protect that regime. And I'm talking internal and external. That's why when people talk to me about, the unrest in Iran, I think it's nothing.
Yeah.
Iran, if the Iranians were worried, they'd adopt genocidal measures inside Iran to protect the regime. The fact that they haven't says they're not worried about it yet, but they would go to great lengths. So protection of the regime, protection of the theocratic regime with all that that means, much of it bad. The number 2 and 3 priorities are destruction of the state of Israel, their language, not mine, and ejection of the United States from the region. They want us out. So objectives 2 and 3, sometimes objective 3 is higher priority than objective 2, vice versa, it depends on what's going on.
Yeah.
But nothing ever approaches objective 1. That is their overriding objective. So when you deal with Iran, they're actually fairly rational within that construct. And the other thing Iran knows is they understand our capabilities. They know what we can do to them. And if they fought a major war with us, objective 1 would be threatened, their principal objective. So when they deal with us, they're conscious of that. Now, deterrence and the balance requires capability and will. The Iranians understand our capability. They have no respect for our will because we've given them good reason to have no respect for our will. You and I were talking earlier about back in the early 80s when the Marines were bombed in Beirut, what did we do? We eventually left as a result of that, and that was an Iranian-backed plot. And other things have happened in the years since. When Qasem Soleimani was bringing explosively formed penetrators into Iraq in 2009, 2010, killing hundreds of American soldiers and Marines, they tried to find a red line, but we never gave it to them. So friends of mine died in those attacks. So they do, but I do believe that Iran respects the language of force. They respect the calculus of violence, and so that's when you're going to do business with Iran, you have to establish that.
So which incidents would you say sort of show that or prove that? Assassination of Qasem Soleimani, I guess you would assess was high impact.
I believe that was high impact, and it changed their calculation of us because they didn't think we would do it. Soleimani personally didn't believe we would do it, and that's why he stopped listening to his security guys.
Yeah.
They said, "You keep going into Baghdad, boss, they're going to kill you one night." Well, they did.
Yeah.
But he wouldn't listen to his security people. So that's a clear example. I would argue that in July of 2019, the Iranians shot down an RQ-4, a big Navy drone flying at 40,000 feet over international airspace. We were going to respond, and at the last minute we didn't. They drew a lesson from that of American weakness, and that was a strong lesson for them. And that I think actually, if you think about the chronology of the events that followed, and we were talking about this earlier, Paul, not taking action in July of 19 made what happened in December of 19 and January of 20, I'm talking about the death of Soleimani, the attack on al-Assad, the attacks on our embassy, that might have been averted had we acted earlier and more strongly with Iran. That's counterfactual, we'll never know.
Yeah.
But I think we could have been bolder.
That's what it seems like to you.
That's right.
Well, if we jump forward to, you weren't there at the time, but the latest escalation between Iranian proxies in the U.S. and the U.S. finally responded.
That's right.
Is your assessment that really got their attention?
I believe it got their attention. Although we waited a long time to do it. It was a very measured response. But as you will just watch, the half-life of these things is very short in the region. So if you're going to deter, you have to demonstrate deterrence frequently.
Yeah,
so I would predict these attacks to pick back up, and that will continue. And so if you shift it a little bit, if we're going to take say what happened between Israel, the little couplet that just went on between Israel and Iran. So over the last couple of years, the fact of the matter is Israel has badly outfought Iran in the shadow war around the theater.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily proxies, but intelligence services, intelligence organizations, sort of culminating in the 1 April strike on the planners in Damascus. So Iran felt, as a result of that, they had to try to reset deterrence with Israel. And they do respect Israeli will. Capabilities and will, more than us. But so they took a page from the Russian playbook, escalate to de-escalate. What you do under that theory is you do something egregious that makes the opponent sit back and say, whoa, I didn't think you were going to do that, and the game may be too rich for me, let's recalculate. The problem is, if you do that, you have to be the Russians.
Yeah.
and you have to have a nuclear card that you can play, or some other remarkable capability. So the Iranians, the core of Iranian deterrence theory is not their nuclear weapons capability. We can talk about that in a minute. I would argue it is their missiles, their ballistic missiles, their land attack cruise missiles, and their drones, which over the last 10 years they've spent vast amounts of money on at the detriment of their population. But I would argue they have a very real capability there, one capable of overmatch against their neighbors. Well, they put a maximum attack in against Israel, going after Nevatim airfield to try to take out what they believe was the base they launched from and to go after the Israeli F-35s. So they were defeated. They were defeated because at least half of their missiles either failed to launch or disintegrated in flight. The drones were shot down. The land attack cruise missiles were shot down by good Israeli capability, B, by good U.S. capability and other NATO nations' capability, but also by the assistance of Saudi Arabia and Jordan, which both provided tipping and queuing data and allowed the access to engage those targets over those respective countries. So the Iranian attack failed, and as a result, Objective 1 is shaken. That has an effect. So they've got to recalculate that, and so the Israelis, I think, were actually, they're often lead-footed in these responses and heavy-handed. This time, I thought they got it just right. They exhibited a dazzling attack into Iran that the Iranians are still trying to figure out. They didn't kill a bunch of people. They demonstrated, whoa, we can come back and do this again, maybe tomorrow night. And what they did do was they kept the United States with them. They didn't push the Arab neighbors away because they have to have the Arab neighbors. If they didn't have overflight authority over Saudi Arabia, it would be very different. It would be very different if Iran attacked them. So it was really an inspired response. So I would say today, Israel's deterrent posture is stronger, Iran's is weaker. Will that push? So we talked a little bit about nuclear weapons. Let me just mention that for a minute. Look, my theory is Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon. They want to be a nuclear weapons capable state. They want to be right on the edge of possessing a nuclear weapon because they can make us dance then. They can make the Europeans dance. They can push for sanctions relief. They can push for money. Once you demonstrably cross that line, well, you've crossed the Rubicon. You can't come back from it. Now, the Iranians are so disorganized, it is possible that they could cross the line without the supreme leader. I mean, we should recognize that. They're so ramshackle in their command and control. But I think they want to be very close. Because here's the thing, they could have a nuclear weapon very quickly, within 6 months, certainly, if they said, we want it. But it would be a big bomb that might be as big as this platform here, which is not, how do you get it to Tel Aviv? Hard to get it to Tel Aviv. So the real problem is not actually nuclear physics for Iran, it's aerodynamical engineering. How do you build a rocket? How do you build a warhead that will survive entry at theater depth, all the way to pick a place you're going to shoot it at? Those are difficult technical problems. And if the Iranians declared nuclear capability, they've still got to cross what I would call the valley of death. They got to wait a year to get a weapon that'll to weaponize it and get it there. And the Israelis will not be silent during that period. Although I'll say before getting off the subject, the Iranian nuclear program, when I first looked at it in 2010, I don't think there's anybody in the world except maybe Eric Kurilla that knows more about attacking it than I do right now. It was a different target in 2010 than it is now in 2024. It is far more difficult for us, That's because they've dug deeper, they've done a variety of things, and their air defenses are much better. And remember, a stealth platform is not an invisible platform, it's a low visibility platform. And so all those considerations make it a long, you can say, well, we're going to take that nuclear program out. Okay, show me. I think that there's grave risk associated with doing that.
Sure, a lot to go back to there. I want to switch gears a bit. You mentioned Ryan Crocker, and a big part of your book is about civil-military relations. The two aspects of that I wanted to ask you about. One is the civilian oversight.
Right.
But secondly is the coordinating with the ambassadors and diplomatic corps. So walk us through your sort of deeper thoughts about the oversight, what's good about it, what works, what doesn't, and then about the deployed diplomats and working with them.
So let me start with the big picture. Look, it is absolutely essential that in this country decisions are made by civilian leadership. And by that I mean the President of the United States, the Secretary, other appointed officials. What you don't want is a situation where the military raises its hand and said, no, that's a bad idea, we're not going to do it, or gets very forceful in fighting. Now, I've been very forceful in argumentation, but when the decision is made, you accept the decision. And any serving officer, and we're talking particularly at the 4-star level here, if the order is not illegal, you have an obligation to execute the order under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So it can be immoral, you can disagree with it on any grounds you choose. But if it's not illegal, and I go back to the 14 lawyers who were happy to huddle around me and give advice, then you got to execute the order. So people ask me frequently, well, why didn't you resign? I never thought about resigning over a policy difference, because if a 4-star resigns because he disagrees with the policy of elected civilian officials,
what do you have? Yeah.
that's right. Then you are making, that's a political act, even though you're a military officer. And the United States deserves better. The other point is, look, these people are getting on these C-17s and flying into Afghanistan or wherever. Nobody gives them a chance to resign because they didn't want to get on the airplane. So they deserve better leadership at the top in that kind of moment. So I feel very strongly about that. It doesn't mean that I haven't had profound policy disagreements.
Well, let me drill down about that, because there might be two aspects to it. One is rule of law, constitution, democracy, civilian. That's undisputed. But let me ask about your experience with, in a sense, is it usually generally the case that because they're looking at a wider picture and a bigger picture, that it's kind of a wise thing to let that political system make the decisions? I mean, putting aside legality and constitutional democracy and rule of law.
So,
in your experience, because the military leaders know so much, and often decision makers in Washington know other things. What's your take on that?
So I'll give you an example. When I used to had the opportunity to describe plans and operations, a phrase I never used was unacceptable risk. Because I can describe the risk. I'm a Jim Mattis trained guy. I know how to describe risk. It was a painful process, but I learned it eventually. So if I'm in a debate with the secretary or whomever, and we're describing something, I might say, look, if we do this, I think we're going to lose an aircraft carrier, or I think we're going to lose half the bomber force that goes in, or I think we're going to be very vulnerable to this. So to me, as the CENTCOM commander, that might be unacceptable. But to the President of the United States, who has a global view, that might be acceptable. So what I want to do is just describe it unemotionally. So I avoid phrases like high, very, very high, super, ultra high risk.
Unacceptable.
You just describe it. And look, everybody knows if I say we're going to lose an aircraft carrier, that's 6,000 people. That's not chump change. So they know the language I'm talking, and you try to calmly describe it. And I'm used to prevailing in a lot of those arguments because when I went up there to talk, we had good modeling, we had good simulations. I was well prepared analytically, and the one thing you want to do in these discussions is, again, something I learned at the feet of the master, was you want to get as much quantitative data as you can. If the decision's 100%, if you can get 90% of it to be quantitative, that everybody essentially agrees on, then there's only 10% that's qualitative. And so you narrow it down to the qualitative decisions that you need or that you have to force. And so you might, easy to say conceptually, sometimes hard to do if you don't agree on the facts. Generally, you can get agreement on the facts because we got the facts. And so I can explain those. But
so a good, robust conversation. At the end of the day, whoever, the president and that political level has the bigger picture.
That's right.
Assessment.
And look,
But you make your case as best you know.
And I've had strong, acrimonious debates with policy. Not before that, as the J5 and as the as the director of the Joint Staff, because really as a combatant commander, you're more focused on the secretary. You still work with policy, but you're really focused on the secretary. But as the owner of plans on the Joint Staff, as the J5, so I had lots of opportunities to interact and clang away with policy. I would argue that disagreements are good. And my reflection was the problem that we got into, and I quote it in the book. I quote a passage from Lytton Strachey, who's an English historian from early in the 20th century. He wrote a book called Eminent Victorians, which is a great book. And it's 4 character sketches of leaders during Queen Victoria's reign. And one of them is a cardinal of the Anglican Church who renounces his Anglicism, converts to Catholicism, goes to Rome to be brought up to speed quickly because they're going to deploy him as a major weapon. But he gets to Rome and he finds that people are cold to him. They don't listen to him. And it's a brilliant line. It's this: the cardinal determined that it wasn't the fact that they disagreed with his ideas so much as the thought that he had ideas at all.
That turned them off.
And so there's a little bit of that
Yeah.
I would just argue from a military side.
Mhm.
I saw a little bit of that. But when it's all said and done, we're going to do what the civilian leadership says.
Yeah,
That doesn't
yeah.
mean there's not going to be a lot of gnashing of teeth and wailing underneath that level.
Yeah.
But you want to, when you get in with the secretary, you want to get diverse viewpoints in there,
Yeah.
and you want to argue those viewpoints. And
Got it.
so,
on the diplomats,
Yeah, sure,
you're deployed
sure.
in the region as military, and
Yeah,
they're deployed
right,
as diplomats.
right.
What's the synergy there? And
So I would tell you this: anytime I went into a country, the first person I saw was the U.S. ambassador. The first person ever. See the U.S. ambassador, get a brief from the country team, and then talk to other agencies that are operative in the embassy. And so I would do all that at the very beginning, and strangely enough, in parts of the region, and it's unfair to our diplomats, their access to national leadership was with me. Because the national leader will see me, and he might not be interested in seeing the ambassador. So the ambassador can come in with me to see the national leader.
Interesting, yeah.
It's just they play us like that. So it's incumbent then on me to make sure there's no space between me and the president's representative in that country, which is the ambassador. And so I was very, very attuned to that because I just believed you really need to have a relationship with the ambassador and also with the regional bureau. And so I would come up here to D.C., see the regional bureau people,
Coordinate
talk to
with
them
them.
a lot.
Yeah.
And the other one that I was really big on, and I feel it's a gravely underutilized resource, is USAID. They can do great good. They're under-resourced. I think that state doesn't favor them possibly as much as they should, just looking in from the outside. But there are problems in Syria, perhaps, with the foundation of ISIS that only addressable through things like USAID in terms of changing the fundamental quality of human life up and down the Euphrates River Valley. We're not going to do that with gun trucks. You're going to do that with
clinics and schools.
Exactly, with opportunities for people to have a decent life. And places like the Al-Hol refugee camp, which is really, we're giving free dental care to people that were incubating into future terrorists. And so there's work that needs to be done there. But
Do you feel that the diplomatic corps in the region was understaffed in general?
I think
during your time?
Yes. If you go back and look at the math, a significant fraction of the ambassadors were acting.
Yeah.
I mean, in
a lot of
Afghanistan,
vacancies.
Ambassador
Yeah.
Wilson, who is an ambassador, was actually the charge A in Afghanistan because he was never credentialed in Afghanistan. Other places, sort of the same thing. And every president's different, every administration is different in how they prioritize and how they put people in and out of the region. But I felt that you can't beat a credentialed ambassador in the country.
Yeah.
And you need to be very close to them. And so one thing I would do every morning, 3 days a week, when I talk to my commanders, I would have every attaché, every SDO DAT in the region in on that call. So the embassy was represented. So he could hear what we were talking about. He would tell me what, you would often people wouldn't have anything to say, so it wasn't a long conference, but if somebody needed to say something, you've got access in right there that you can do that. And I would typically talk to ambassadors pretty frequently, but again, every time I went in, I would go see the ambassador. And if I had a conversation with a head of state or a senior military official in that country, I'd make sure the ambassador got a debrief of that. I think it's important, and it's the responsibility of the military commander to do that.
Okay.
But I think broadly, we are gravely under-resourced in the Department of State,
Yeah.
gravely under-resourced, and that's endemic not only in CENTCOM, but across the rest of the world.
Yeah, understood. I'm going to ask a couple more questions and then turn it over to the audience, so think of your questions. In Europe, if you were head of European Command, you'd be working within a clear alliance and with clear partnerships and alliances. There are partners, there are friends, somewhat allies in the region. But tell us a bit how that felt. Did you feel you really were part of coalitions and alliances, or were you going it alone a lot of the time?
So during my time at CENTCOM, I think some remarkable things happened. I think the Abraham Accords is a remarkable document. We'll see what it builds into. But what it did was it brought Israel into the region a little bit. The bureaucratic thing that happened that is very important was we brought Israel into the Central Command region from EUCOM, and they've been with EUCOM for a lot of reasons going back many years, none of which are extant anymore. And EUCOM's fully focused on Russia. Israel's an off-axis thing for them. So on the other hand, Israel's main threat is Iran. That's my main threat too. So they were very good and compelling reasons.
Yeah.
And I actually suggested that to Secretary Esper in a zero-based review in the spring of '20. He adopted it, policy disagreed. The Joint Chiefs disagreed. The chairman agreed. And so eventually, Secretary Esper took it across the river, and President Trump signed it around 10 January 2021, right before he left office. I had a bet with my J5, a Diet Coke bet. I said, he's not going to sign it. It's not going to happen. And we'll have to start all over again.
Yeah.
Well, I was happy to buy that Diet Coke. And so that was important. But what that meant was, over the in 2010, under General Mattis, we tried very hard to orient nations in the region. And by that I mean really UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar on occasion, Oman, against the Iranian threat. And the Iranian threat is an air and missile threat. Iran doesn't have the ability to deploy its army across the street, much less into another country. So if a war occurs, it will be a fires war. So in 2010, we tried, and a guy named Dave Goldfein, who many of you know, Chief of Staff of the Air Force and a wonderful leader, was the AFCENT commander. We worked hard to try to get them together to think about what we call integrated air and missile defense. There were no takers.
Yeah.
So what's happened now is two things, well, several things. Israel's come into the region, number one. Number two, they're a little skeptical about U.S. support. They're a little worried that we may or may not be there.
Yeah.
And the imminence of the Iranian threat is now very, very clear. The attack on Saudi Aramco in September 2019, the attack on al-Assad, what just happened, all of these things together have convinced at the military level, and maybe the mod level,
they see it very clearly.
They see that threat very clearly. So what I was able to do, and I can say this because it's been widely publicized, in 2020 and 2021, in August, let me get this right, no, 21 and 22. In August of 21, during the middle of the Afghan withdrawal, I convened a secret meeting at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. The Egyptians hosted it. We brought all the Chads in the region together, including the Israeli Chad. And we talked about integrated air and missile defense. And it wasn't just a photo op. There were hundreds of hours of staff work that went into it before, where 2-star generals, 1-star generals, colonels, lieutenant colonels, we talked about how we might cooperate and share information. Because here's the thing, the beauty of air and missile defense is it's relatively low-hanging fruit. You don't have to give up sovereignty to participate in it, because what you're doing is sharing information. You're building a common operational picture. You're saying, I see this, here's what can we do? And so nations in the region are more they're more willing to do that, especially if the United States is the honest broker. And we use our CAOC, our Air Operations Center, which is split now between what goes on in Doha and what goes on back at Shaw Air Force Base.
And is there any real progress in that? And is the attack on Israel and the information that was shared proof of that?
I would say that's a proof of concept.
Proof of concept.
I would say, yeah, and it worked. So yes, so we met again in 2022. And so what you do is you talk about how you share information. In a perfect world, you'd like to do it by data link. You don't always get to that. Sometimes you do it by phone call, and that is profoundly, painfully slow, but you can still do it.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be able to do it in a pure missile engagement, but in engagements like we saw in April, you can do it. So nations share that information. And look, let's be honest, some of the Arab nations won't share it with each other, actually. So we're not just talking about concern about sharing it with Israel. On the other hand, they see what Israel has, and they like it. They like Iron Dome.
And they see how they defended themselves.
And they see, but let's be clear, Israel's defense would not have been as effective as it was had it not been for the participation of Saudi Arabia and Jordan. So if you think of the map, the one advantage Israel has is they've got depth against Iran, because you've got to fly those countries to get there. Now Saudi Arabia doesn't have that depth. They're very close. So it's a little different problem for them. But I would argue that at the middle level, there's broad understanding of the nature of the threat. There's broad desire to share tactics, techniques, and procedures, and to allow overflight. Now look, it's got to go ultimately to the political level, and you've got to get high-level political buy-in on that as well. Some nations have done it. Some nations, there's still work to be done. But I would argue that what happened in mid-April was actually a perfect demonstration of that capability. And everybody drew notes from that. I mean, Saudis did, UAE, everybody did, and they saw how it works. And they want some of that.
Yeah, got it.
Because the threat, sure, there's a proxy threat out there, and we shouldn't discount that. But the real threat that the Iranians have looked at, and I would argue greater than the nuclear threat, are those missiles, ballistic missiles, those land attack cruise missiles, and those drones.
Yeah.
And
they've used them repeatedly.
And they've used them repeatedly, and then they used them in a massive attack. People say, well, the Iranians, it was a minor attack. It was a maximum attack. So here's the thing that many people don't realize. Iranian ballistic missiles are stored underground. They've got to be taken out of storage and put on a tractor erector launcher, what we call a TEL. For the sake of argument, let's say there's 150 of those. That's your salvo rate. You can fire 150, bang. You got to go back, reload, go back out and fire again. So you can't say, we're going to fire 1,000 missiles at Israel. No, you're not. You're going to fire whatever your throughput is. And if you get into an extended engagement, those TELs become vulnerable because we will go after those TELs and, well, I'll just leave it there.
Degrade them, yeah.
You would go after those TELs, so it becomes an exchange rate problem. How fast can they generate attacks against what you can do to decrease their TELs? But Iran now look, so Iran is digging holes for their missiles now, going to fixed positions. We should encourage that. If it's fixed, it'll die. Doesn't matter how deep you dig it, we're going to get it. And we can prevent it from being launched. So they're doing it, sometimes it's just fashion that makes people do this, the idea that they've got silos, we need silos. They don't need silos, they should stay mobile. The Russian strategic force is a significant fraction of it is mobile, which gives us great problems in strategic deterrence. So at any rate.
All right, final question before turning to the audience. And this is a question I'm cribbing from my colleague Courtney Lobel, our Chief Development Officer, which was, what did you learn in your 3 years, and in retrospect you would have done differently had you been deployed again in 2019?
Sure. I would have argued, I really think, and we talked about this upstairs, in July of 2019, when we did not respond to the Iranian downing of the RQ-4, that was a missed opportunity. Now, look, I believe President Trump made a decision based on bad advice he got in the White House by lawyers. He said, our collateral damage estimate, we're going to kill 150 people. I have pretty good estimates of it, and we were going to kill a night watchman, maybe, because the Iranians didn't want to be at the missile sites because they knew we were going to hit them. So they didn't want to be there on the receiving end of JDAMs or whatever we were going to use. So, it was a manageable problem. It would have been a strike in Iran, which would have been significant, but that wasn't the reason the president didn't do it. He didn't do it because he was told you're going to kill 150 people. So if we were going to kill 150 people, I would not have recommended the operation because I agree that is not proportionate to shooting down an unmanned, unarmed RQ-4. I wish I had a way to convey that better at the time. I just, in the moment, sometimes I regret that. I regret not arguing. The other thing I regret is at the very beginning, in 2019, you had a national defense strategy that was vocally focused on the Pacific. You had a U.S. president that was interested in Iran. So it's a say-do mismatch inside the Department of Defense, which is driven by its written guidance, the NDS. And everyone here realizes the NDS means nothing outside the Department of Defense. No one cares about it. But it is in fact good guidance inside the department. Yeah. But outside the department, state doesn't act on the NDS. So I felt that I should have probably argued for a named operation, or fought for resources more clearly, or to have a resourcing decision made, which then would have cleared the path forward. I might have got it, I might not have got it, but I didn't do that. If I had to go back and do it, I would go back and do that again.
Okay, thank you, General. Raise your hand, say who you are, wait for a microphone because we are taping everything. Our friend here in the front, sir.
William Lawrence. Could you address the assassination of Soleimani, the legality of it, and maybe Calamar's report on the imminence of the threat, and and she talked a lot about the precedent of that attack on assassinating leaders with drones.
So let me begin by saying it was not an assassination. Assassination is an illegal act, and I would not have been able to carry that order out had it been illegal. So we struck a legitimate military target. The president acted under a couple of different authorities that he had, and the lawyers can argue about it. He acted under his Article 2 authority to defend the United States. He acted under the authorization for the use of military force. So the authorities were there to conduct the strike. Now, we may agree or disagree that it was a good thing to do. I happen to think it was a good thing to do, but I understand that. But it's absolutely a legal operation. And so why we did it was there was compelling evidence, compelling to me, that he was going into Baghdad to further coordinate attacks against U.S. forces. And so for me, the proposition became, what's the greater risk? Action take him out or inaction, because we believed if he were taken out, they would stumble. And they have stumbled since then. They've never been able to replace him. And so when you think about, no one in the moment, was thinking deeply about the long-term effects, because we were talking about an immediate pressing operational problem. And that's what drove it. Now, I felt the Iranians would strike back, and some people agree with me, some people didn't agree with me. They did strike back, and they did strike back to try to kill Americans. That they didn't have success was a testimony to the ability of the joint force to see the enemy and to take action to prevent that from happening. Now, people got traumatic brain injuries, which is regrettable, but better than deaths. And so what that allowed, and you may be aware, the Iranians also signaled us through Swiss channels as the missiles landed on Al-Assad, they were finished. This is it. We consider this over. So I think actually President Trump made a wise decision. He walked away from it. And believe me, I was some pretty tense moments there, and I was conscious of the reporting I was giving, because if I believe this, had Americans died, it would have been a very different morning in the theater than what actually happened. We would have whacked them pretty good, I suspect. I don't know that, but that's another counterfactual. But so to answer your question, I thought there was compelling tactical evidence. I think we were on solid legal grounds to take the strike, and I believe it did have the larger effect that we've already talked about a little bit before now of deterring Iran. So I think in that sense, if I had to do it again, I'd give the same advice, I'd take the same action. Did that get to your question? Yeah. Absolutely, sure.
Thank you. Lady in the fourth row. You, yes. Wait for the microphone.
Thank you.
Yes, you.
My name is Charlotte. I'm a student. I'm wondering, well, the subtitle of your book is War in the about war in the 21st century. And I'm wondering if you can do a little bit of predicting and
Sure.
and sort of just speak to what degree you think war and conflict might be centered more around resource wars or global climate change, and how that might change sort of the overall battlefield and what we're fighting about.
Sure. So when we talk about these things, we need to remember that we're only half the equation. The opponent gets a view. I don't believe the Russians or the Chinese worry particularly much about global climate change as they design their force and as they prepare for what they're going to do. Now, we do, and we should, because that's an imperative that we've undertaken. So I do believe that you're right, that increasingly wars are going to be fought over limited resources. Many nations in the Middle East, for example, Jordan's aquifer is going bad. That's going to be a real problem for Jordan going forward. There are other nations that face those similar kinds of problems. And eventually, yes, I think those are all, I'm not sure that's new though. You know what I'm saying? I think wars have been fought for resources for many hundreds, thousands of years. But you're right, particularly in the Middle East, it's going to become something like that. The other thing that I see out there is the weaponization of hunger. I think we're going to see that. I saw that in Syria, and it just broke my heart that we couldn't be better and do more to prevent that. And it's happened in Yemen as well. There are other places in the region, and it's happening in Europe, in other places, but I know most about the central region. So I think all those things are going to be in play as we go forward. As for the actual nature of war itself going forward, I think that it's going to be, I think we have decided to avert our eyes from the nuclear component of warfare. The Russians have not. And if you want to read a really good article, read a 1977 article written by Richard Pipes entitled "Why the Soviet Union Thinks It Can Fight and Win a Nuclear War." Because I would tell you, every word written in that article is as true today as it was in 1977. You know, we've divested all our tactical nuclear weapons. We had 10,000 at the end of the Cold War. Today we got a couple hundred B-61 gravity-delivered devices and a handful of B-83s, little bigger bombs. The Russians still have 4,000 or so tactical nuclear weapons that aren't covered by any arms limitation because they didn't get rid of them. We got rid of them under the assumption that they would do the same. Well, they didn't get the memo. So no U.S. warship has a nuclear weapon on it except the big ballistic missile submarines. Every Russian warship out there has nuclear capability. And the Moskva that the Ukrainians sunk, confident that ship had nuclear weapons on it, to give you just one example. I think we're averse to the use of nuclear weapons because we bear the unique moral burden of having dropped 2 of them in anger, and that has affected the way we think about it. The Russians and the Chinese have a much more cold-eyed, clear-eyed approach to nuclear weapons. They think about fighting into a nuclear war, through a nuclear war, and after a nuclear war. I was the director of the Joint Staff. I know a lot about this. We don't think that way. We don't think through the nuclear war. We end it when the big boom goes off, and but the Russians talk about what's going to happen afterwards. So I think that's something, if I were just going to pick one thing, we need to think about that. And the other thing would be, we are dependent on information. We talk about quantum computing, we talk about AI, but if you can't communicate, that's absolutely useless. And nuclear weapons and the electromagnetic pulses associated with nuclear weapons and other things that deliver electromagnetic pulse that aren't nuclear are going to profoundly limit our ability to communicate. So all the things we're talking about are going to come under direct and sustained attack in future warfare. And it's very, very expensive to prepare for this. Strangely enough, in the 1980s, we were well prepared for this. We were well prepared to fight on a nuclear EMP battlefield. We're not now. And that's going to be a lesson probably we're going to learn the hard way. Great question. Thanks for asking.
Very good question. The young man in the fourth row again, he's been patient. And then we turn to the right wing.
General, thank you for your service and for your insights. About Afghanistan, what went wrong? And are you scared or afraid from a similar scenario in Iraq if a real deal and implementation of the Iraqi constitution doesn't happen?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll deal with Afghanistan and then come to Iraq. And if I don't capture it, remind me, okay, at the end. So look, at the broadest possible level, I would argue that what happened in August 2021 in Iraq was the inevitable consequence of two U.S. presidents who were as unalike in every way as two in our history, but both share an overarching policy objective of leaving Afghanistan regardless of the consequences. That's what led President Trump and his team to negotiate the Doha Agreement. That's what led President Biden, who shared a common perspective of getting out of Afghanistan, to take the Trump plan, he's left at 2,500 troops, and to go to effectively zero. And I would argue that's what actually allowed it to happen. Now, we can go back to 2001 and we can talk about many missed opportunities. Some of those are military, some of those are not. Where we could have killed bin Laden in the fall of 2001, and that is purely a military mistake. Nobody but the U.S. military, and particularly my predecessor at CENTCOM, had an opportunity to take him off the battlefield. Had that happened, a lot of things could have been different. We fought a counterinsurgency war in Afghanistan with a very good set of doctrinal rules, but we ignored the fundamental doctrinal rule. You can't do it if the opponent has a sanctuary, and he had a sanctuary in Pakistan. And he had a sanctuary in Pakistan because for very complex reasons, the Pakistanis didn't think we were going to stay. So I can't tell you how many meals I've eaten with General Bajwa, who's the chief of Army Staff in Pakistan, a friend of mine, and where I would tell him, we're staying. He said, no, you're not. Well, he was right and I'm wrong, because we left. And so a lot of reasons that went into it. We went in for a very narrow reason, to prevent attacks on our homeland. The mission set expanded dramatically. So I mean, there's all kinds of things I can cite, but I think really you get back to the end of it, the laws of history operate even against the United States. If you leave, you don't get to set the terms of how that leaving happens and what happens after you go. And so we sometimes think we have some kind of elite relationship with history that allows us to operate outside its laws. Well, they operate against the United States as they do every other nation, every other empire in history. And we saw that in the end state in Afghanistan. So I am concerned about what's going on in Afghanistan now. I will tell you this, we're not actually looking into Afghanistan because CENTCOM doesn't have a lot of MQ-9s and they got other places to look. So I would tell you on a daily basis, we probably have no idea what's going on, except what we read, what comes out on open source. Now, for the sake of argument, I assume we probably still look at little parts of Pakistan going after Al-Qaeda, but that's not my department. So that's a little different. But we're not looking at ISIS-K. And I think everybody here knows the Taliban harbors no intention of attacking the United States. That's not, and we didn't go in because the Taliban attacked the United States. We went in because of Al-Qaeda and then ISIS-K, that it was essentially nested inside Afghanistan because of the Taliban's affiliation with AQ and the Taliban's inability to address ISIS-K. And that ISIS-K problem is going to grow. It's going to grow because they're unmolested, they're uncontested. They carried out a very successful attack in Russia a couple of months ago, and they aim and will intend to attack us again. My successor, General Kurilla, testified about this in the spring and gave good testimony on the rising nature of the threat. So Iraq, I believe that ultimately Iraq wants us to stay, and I believe however rickety that agreement is, that they want us to stay. I recognize all the pressures that are building. I recognize the Iranian penetration of the government. I got all that, but I think when it's all said and done, they're going to want to continue U.S. military presence in Iraq. And I guess we're probably at 2,000 plus right now, but there's a significant NATO presence there. The NATO presence would be larger if not what we're going on up in Ukraine. NATO's attention is rightly pretty much taken up fully with what's going on in Ukraine right now. But I think the odds are better than even we're going to stay in Iraq for the foreseeable future. Look, so over time, we should get smaller, and we should want to transition to a more normalized security agreement if that's what the Iraqis want. But I'm not so sure that's what the Iraqis want, actually.
Thanks. So I'm glad we talked.
Great question.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking that.
And thanks for asking about Afghanistan and Iraq. I wanted to get to them, but I ran out of time, so I'm glad we got them in the Q&A. I'm going to pivot right and forward. What? Okay. Eric, where's Eric? There's Eric. Eric, go.
Oh, great. Ask me a good one.
Eric Schmidt. Last week, President Biden, in his speech, talked about how, at this point, Hamas no longer has the ability to carry out the kind of attack they did on October 7th. Can you give us your military assessment of the war in Gaza right now, and specifically the Rafah operation, and why has it been so difficult for the U.S. in providing advice, whether it's from Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, the President himself, to carry out more focused target attacks and to move civilians out of the way? Civilians obviously are still being killed in large numbers. Why is that? Are they just not heeding the advice? Is it what's your take on the overall? Thank you.
So I think Israel has managed, on a military level, Israel has managed to dismantle the majority of what I would call the formal Hamas structure. They've had less success, markedly less success, against senior military leadership and senior political leadership. I think that is largely untouched. And I don't read I read what I read in your newspaper, Eric. But I don't think they've gotten to that. Look, if Sinwar were killed tonight, I think the Israelis would have a lot more flexibility about what they're going to do in Gaza. But the other part of the problem is Hamas has a brilliant concept for defense. You embed with people. You keep people around you all the time. So any Israeli commander who's weighing, am I going to strike it or am I not going to strike it, he's going to kill civilians. Or you're not going to strike these targets. Well, because of the anger that and the approach Israel's taken to the conflict, they're willing to accept that proportionality. I don't know what we would do under those circumstances. I just don't know. But as you know, the law of armed conflict accepts the inevitability of innocents dying. But the test is always, it shouldn't be intentional, and it should be weighed against the objective gained. And I'm with you. But when you talk about more focused operations, that's an easy thing to say, but combat in a built-up area is very, very hard. You can't, when I think about specialized operations in a built-up area, I think about Black Hawk Down. There's the best guys in the world that got in trouble in an urban area, and we should remember that. I was very lucky, I'll digress for 1 second. When we went after Baghdadi in the fall of 2019, he was living in Western Syria, I'll say this very quickly, and he took 14 children out there, A, as sexual slaves, and B, because he knew it would complicate our targeting. I looked for a month and a half to find a way to get him with an innovative weapon where we wouldn't kill the children. Ultimately, I wouldn't accept that risk, so we sent a raid force out there to do it. And only 2 children died because he blew himself up with them. So those are but that's an easy decision for me to make because a raid force out there is in the middle of the desert. You go down an urban street, it's just very hard to do. It's easy to say, Eric, it's hard to do. And the Israelis are good. They're not as good as us, but they're good. But it would be very hard for us to do that. So when people say, well, we can do it targeted special operations, I actually am not sure you can do that. Doesn't mean that I'm not sensitive to what you're talking about moving people, getting them out. But I would argue that, again, that Hamas is actively trying to prevent that from happening. The last thing Hamas wants is civilians to leave Rafah because then they're naked. Just like the last thing, my own personal opinion is, I think it's a reach to think these hostages are coming back, the Israeli hostages. They may give some around the edges, the core military people that they've got. That's their nuclear weapon. Why would you give that up? And we know there's a history of holding hostages for years, many years in this region. And so I think all of those things put the Israeli operational design in a bad place. But look, I would also say, just as an observation, you begin a plan with an eye to the end state. I've never understood their end state. I've never understood how you when you're building a plan, you say, here's where I want to be in 6 months. These are the performance indicators I want to do. And you got to set realistic ones that you can measure, not unrealistic ones. And then once you describe that, then you mentally look at the path back to where you are now and you see how you get there. What are the decisions you got to make? And look, these guys are my friends. The just retired, Chief of Staff Aviv Kahavi is a close personal friend of mine. So I struggle with I struggle with how they're designing this and what they're trying to do. And I think the IDF is struggling with it as well, because I don't see how it ends. Look, my perspective, and my friends in Israel laugh at me when I say it, is it's got to be some form of a two-state solution. That's just where I'm at. I don't know that it needs to be Oslo-based. There's a lot of discussion that can happen there, but otherwise we're going to be fighting forever. And so that's a significant problem. Now, internal politics in Israel, I'm not an expert on it, but I think it's a particularly difficult time to try to get a decision out of them for the reasons that you're probably more familiar with than me. But on the other hand, what's not happened is interesting too. LH has not come into the fight. And the Katyushas they're lobbing across the border, that's nothing. If they came in, if Nasrallah chose to come in, you'd be sucking down 150 missiles an hour in downtown Tel Aviv. Now, Israelis would defend most of that, not all of it, but they've got tens and tens of thousands of missiles with the range and accuracy to legitimately compress the Israelis to the maximum in their ability to defend. They have not chosen to come in. And everybody else is not overly vocal about it in the region. They're doing what they have to do. I go back to, that's why I think the normalization path between Saudi Arabia and Israel is going to continue. Whatever happens in Gaza, it's going to continue. There may be a road bump, there may be a halt for a while, but it is inevitable because I believe Saudi leadership recognizes the nature of the threat from Iran and the advantages that a relationship with Israel brings to them. Did I get to your question, Eric? Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a better answer. I wish it were different. I just wish it were. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. And now, actually you? Okay.
General Brian Katulis. Brian Katulis here at MEI. Thanks for your service, and I look forward to reading the book. Building off of Eric's last question, I wanted you to imagine the hypothetical that there is a ceasefire,
right,
and that Biden's plan that he put out on Friday,
right,
we're moving towards a withdrawal of Israeli forces.
Right.
There's notion of a multinational
right,
force that could
right,
go in there.
Right.
Do you see any role that CENTCOM can play, given what you said about interoperability, bringing Israel into this?
Right.
I know this is hypothetical, right, and it's so far afield, but is this something that could reassure all of the parties about the security commitments that need to be delivered to secure Israel as well as the Palestinian people of Gaza? Is there some role that CENTCOM, even behind the scenes, could play in building that force?
Certainly behind the scenes. The problem is the risk of putting a U.S. force in there is so great that any American president, not President Biden, or any American president, is going to have to think long and hard before you commit to do that. Having said that, I think that there's a path to getting regional and other troops in there to do this, and I think there's actually a path to funding those regional troops that doesn't involve the United States. So I think all of those things are possible. And when I think of an end state, that's sort of the end state I have in mind, something like that. Look, and there are huge issues that need to be worked out. I got that. But you got to do something about conditions in Gaza. Otherwise, you're committing to an endless war for the Israelis, and I don't think they want that. Actually, I don't think the army can. The problem with armies are once you use them, combat is a corrosive environment. It affects the military. Anybody who says that he's not corroded by exposure is lying. And so it affects your military, particularly when you're fighting in a built-up area, which is physically the most demanding environment. The constant concussions that just knock you around, you're deaf half the time, you're shouting at people, people are talking, you can't hear them. It's a young person's game. It's very much a young person's game. But it eats human beings up, both physically, tragically, but also, I would argue, morally.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. I'll take one from the right and one from the left. Gentleman in the...
Thank you. Kenneth Katzman, Soufont Center. You mentioned unacceptable to you to have an aircraft carrier taken out. I think we might agree that that would be a very traumatic event for the American public, do we not? what is realistically in the region, CENTCOM region, the possibility of that? Houthis, Iran, Lebanese Hezbollah, and what do you think about that possibility?
I think the possibility of us losing a carrier in the Middle East is slim. But if you leave billion-dollar warships sitting in a narrow, constrained water space and allow people to shoot rockets at them endlessly, the battlefield has a law, an iron law of reversion to the mean. Now, here's the thing that people don't realize. If you hit a 300,000-ton tanker with a missile, it goes boink and falls off, the crew may not even know it hit the ship. If you hit a destroyer with a missile, it will cause grave damage because the destroyer is 8,000 tons versus 300,000 tons, is packed with explosives. Now, it's hard to hit the destroyer, but if you hit a warship, it's going to be very different than hitting a big 300,000-ton tanker. So my concern with the way we're playing the game with the Houthis right now is, look, we went in there, we said to open the strait. Not to defend Israel, but to open the strait for I would argue, very good reasons. We're a maritime nation. We believe free right of passage on the high seas. We share that vision with other people. So we've gone in and we've sort of dribbled and drabbed them. The Houthis they are aggressive. They are relentless. They're great engineers. I respect them. But they too will respond if they're struck hard. So you got a carrier that's out there in what we call mod lock, steaming back and forth, protecting itself. And so you just need to we can use that offensively, we can do other things. I would argue for a more offensive posture. Maybe good reasons that we're not doing that, but I know what I read.
Thanks. Question? Yes, the lady on the back there.
Hello, General. Thank you so much for your great presentation. I'm Alexandria with the State Department, so sure. I'm just taking some time here to talk to you. Just kind of curious to know, how do you see the success and challenges of the evacuation of Afghan allies and how that can impact the future in terms of how we work with other nations that we engage with conflict with? Yeah.
Look, I think it's evident. We brought 124,000 people out. If you put a Venn diagram up, 124,000 people who we wanted to get out, they don't overlap completely or even primarily. So we got a lot of people out. We also got a lot of people out that forced their way to the head of the line. And a lot of people that we wanted to get out remained. So one of the reasons at the very end why I argued that we needed to get out by the 31st. Now this argument's happening on the 27th of August. So, I had I didn't want to leave, but now we're in execution. Said if we get out by the 31st, as we said we will, then that will make it easier for us to work subsequent problems getting our ally, the people, the at-risk Afghans out that we want to get out. Whereas if we stay beyond the 31st, then we're probably going to have to fight the Taliban to do that. It'll make it much harder to accomplish those objectives. So I think, I don't follow it real closely, but I think we have been uneven, very uneven on how we've been able to get people out, because the Taliban, the people that are leaving are the best and the brightest. They're good people. The Taliban think they need to stay there, whether they want to stay or not, to do work in the country. So the Taliban have generally been very good, I think, about getting U.S. citizens out. If we identify a U.S. citizen, I think, however, that person, that man or woman or child comes out pretty quickly. And most of them, vast majority are all out, except for people that want to remain there for whatever reason. But I think the jury is not favorable to us, actually, on getting the Afghan allies out. And the people will draw conclusions from that. You're right. Yes.
Do you have time for a couple more questions?
I'll take two more questions.
All right, gentleman right there.
Sure.
Thank you. Good afternoon, General McKenzie. My name is Todd Wiggins, and I'm a video production specialist here. And I have a question about what the takeaway message will be come November, and how whomever ends up getting reelected will affect how policy or how implement of your interests would be over there, and what kind of a stake do we have in the election?
Yeah, so look, my opinion is no better than anybody else's. I would argue that we know and understand what President Biden's position is going to be. I think in the Middle East, President Trump's position is not necessarily going to vary markedly from it, particularly in relation to Israel. He might take a harder line on Iran. He might not. I don't know. I haven't heard him talk about that. But I think in the area I know something about, I'm not sure there'd be a vast, a huge shift in the Middle East as a result of that. Could be. Now, NATO's another matter. What happens in the Pacific is another matter. You have significant policy differences there. But in the area I know about, I don't think there'd be a lot. I don't think there would be huge changes should President Biden leave office and President Trump came in. And what we're doing in the region on a day-to-day basis might over time, but we're out of Afghanistan. That's a done deal. We're at a very low force level in Iraq. Could go lower in Iraq. That could be a potential decision. Could come out of Syria. Those are all possibilities. But I also know there's possibilities that the current administration is investigating. So I don't know that I could discern a big difference right now. Good question. Thanks for asking.
Thanks. A final question from Mr. Halverson there.
Hi there, General. Thanks
Sure.
so much for coming today.
We need the microphone for the recording, sir.
Thank you, General. I really appreciated your insights on Iran. I agreed with a lot of them, especially the way you think the Islamic Republic behaves. I would love to get your opinions on the economic and political maximum pressure campaign. Do you think it's effective? Do you think it complements the long-term military goal of Iranian deterrence? And where can we improve our political and economic policy towards Iran to better deter a complicated regime like the Islamic Republic that isn't very well understood in the United States?
Sure. So the maximum pressure campaign, which I saw for my first year and a half, 2 years at Central Command, it had some effect on Iran. It didn't change basic Iranian policies. It didn't push them. It didn't push them to negotiate. Iran is able to absorb a vast amount of pain, and then perhaps they draw strength from that. Actually, you got to be careful what you do when you apply sanctions. Look, I would argue if we want to deal with Iran in the long term, first of all, it does need to be an integrated policy. You can't do it with the military element alone. You can't do it with the diplomatic element alone and the economic element. But you've got to have something there. And I would also argue we're better when we do it with other nations. Look, I'm an internationalist. I make no apologies for that. I think the United States is better when we work with like-minded nations. We had that early on, and we lost it when we went with the maximum pressure campaign. Nations peeled off. So whatever you got to do to bring nations on board with you, I think is better. The problem with that is you never get what you want exactly. But I think sometimes accepting a lower bar, but gaining partnership with other nations is very important to do that, particularly in the region where we need to remember that everything you do requires somebody to agree that you're going to be there. ABO, access, basing, and overflight. That's the bane of every CENTCOM commander. 2 weeks ago, UAE began to limit our flights out of Al Dhafra. I don't know the details of that. I just know what I read in the Wall Street Journal. So you got to deal with that. And so it's the land of imperfect solutions. It's a fascinating region. I wish I had better answers for some of those questions. Thanks for asking.
Sure. Thank you. Well, General McKenzie, thank you for your service. Thank you for writing the book and sharing your insights through that. I encourage everybody to buy it and read it.
Buy two.
Buy two, yes, there you go. Thank you for spending your time with us today, and it's been a pleasure having you. And please join me in thanking General McKenzie.